we get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
There's a study that came out in 2020 in Nature. It's a big journal. It's a big deal. And it had some interesting findings, and I'm not saying that they're wrong. Other people are saying they're wrong, though. I just wanted to talk a little bit. There's sort of an update. There's a kerfuffle. There's a science kerfuffle. And I thought it would be fun because, to be clear, this is one of those times when sometimes science just is messy. And so there are perfectly reasonable ways to interpret the data, and people sometimes start food fights over it through academic journals. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's a really interesting study that was released in 2022. So I thought we could talk about it, and then I'll just give you an update quickly on some of the stuff that's going on in the more recent literature. Bubonic plague is well and alive in prairie dog colonies, and when we were out doing surveys, we always had to be careful. Was it an abandoned prairie dog colony? And if so, if you start feeling unwell, make sure they test you for the Black Death. Yeah, bubonic plague is around. We just don't have the outbreaks that we used to because yay, modern medicine. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this video, right? So Balint, I'm going to talk to you about this. Chat, be with me on this. The idea is we all have genes that make ourselves like a little different from each other, and we might have slightly different versions. I liked their like vanilla flavored versus cherry flavored version of a gene, right? So little tiny tweaks that are just floating around in us, in the population as well. And the idea is over time, evolution might act on those different gene flavors for some reason, maybe over 100 generations or 1,000 generations. There's some benefit to having cherry flavored gene. And so that makes those people more successful, like biologically, like they create more children, they're healthier, whatever it may be. And so that gene becomes more common, right? More people with that gene variant exist because their ancestors were able to have more children and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's kind of how natural selection works. There's also this thing called genetic drift, and it mostly is just random. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially sometimes cherry flavored can become more common for no particular reason. It's just because like you roll the dice and sometimes you get strings of sixes, right? So for random chance, for not wanting to go into the details of it. Okay. So that's the question that these researchers had was, normally we see evolution and natural selection across very large time scales. But was the plague, this coming of the plague, was it extreme enough that we can see evolution on a small scale, like small time scale, right? That seems like a reasonable question to me. Balint, how do you feel about that? Like, the Black Death killed, I mean, depends on the population, but it killed between like 30 to 50% of
where's my drink?
The population in some
Black
areas.
drink.
So if there was a small gene variant that gave you more success in recovering from the plague or fighting off the plague,
don't tell me you forgot my drink!
Maybe it would be more common in folks after the plague than before the plague. Does that make sense? Okay.
Like, and presumably it can happen with other diseases too, right? It could wipe out a ton of people.
It could. The thing is, like, the reason most people or most evolutionary biologists don't find it convincing is it's just on such a short time window.
That have been over hundreds of years?
Yeah, I mean, like, so we know that diseases press natural selection, but it's usually over an extended amount of time, over many, many, many generations.
So
and the
that's why
is,
hundreds, because like of a generation time for a person would
yeah.
take. Okay.
So you'd expect like thousands of years.
Okay.
Right? And so, but their question is, can we find something interesting in the genetics of the people who survived the plague immediately after those who survived the plague? Does their DNA look any different than the people who died during the plague or before the plague? So they took a couple different samples based on cemeteries. They knew the dating, and the DNA sequencing is good-ish enough. This DNA was not in good shape, you guys. It was ugly. I looked in the supplement. It wasn't good. But they were able to get regions that they were interested in. They were interested in immune genes, which you might imagine. If they're interested in seeing if the plague was changing our genetics, like survivors of the plague had something fundamentally different about their DNA than the population beforehand, they're probably not looking at like hair color or like did they have freckles. It was immune related genes is what they were looking at. What this study in 2022 was looking at is they were wondering if they could see small scale evolution, like small scale natural selection on human beings after the Black Death, because it killed such a high percent of people in the area. They were wondering, do the survivors have genetics that look different than the people who lived there before the Black Death hit? So it's sort of like before and after. Is there a difference?
Do you specify macro and micro evolution?
Yeah, I mean, they're looking for really small gene variations here. So we're talking super microevolution, but again, they're just looking for evidence of natural selection, because normally you don't see it on this time scale. All right, so that's what they were looking for. That was their reasoning. So this is the study they did. They went around and got several hundred DNA samples from the Middle Ages based on graves, how the graves were marked. And they had a filtering criteria, and they had 4 interesting hits. So they had 4 regions of the genome that they were interested in.
GK says it's almost like we can't escape terminal diseases no matter what.
Well, I think the idea is it's all about a balancing act. It's the solution is not just supercharge your immune system. Because when you supercharge your immune system, it's supercharged and it might just turn on you, which is autoimmune disease. All right, so this is a very convincing and interesting story, Balint, right?
Yeah, and I can buy it. Like, it sounds reasonable.
It sounds reasonable, and it's exciting.
Yeah.
Because it's like how the double-edged side of natural selection. That's great. Interesting. Compelling. Nature thought it was compelling. Nature is one of the biggest journals that you can publish in our field chat. The other thing, though, I'm usually skeptical of just like we usually call these GWAS studies, genome-wide studies I'm a molecular lady. I like to do experiments. So I would normally have dismissed the study. However, the gene that they found that they were interested in, they did a tiny bit of bench work, Balint, a tiny bit, and they showed that in a petri dish, macrophages with the full-length protein produced more cytokines in response to this thing.
This is the Nature paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they did a tiny bit of experimental work that suggested the immune gene that they found that they said helped you survive the Black Death back in the Middle Ages actually has a measurable effect. So, that's the story, right? That's the story they told us. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I like that they did the effort of doing a tiny bit of bench work. A new study has come out, not published in Nature, because it's a follow-up study by a different group, and they had negative findings. So, of course, it's not published in Nature. It's published in Science Advances. They essentially did the same thing. They just looked, instead of in London, they looked in Cambridge. And they were looking at a variety of different things, but they also wanted to go through and measure to see if they could agree with what had been previously found. And they found that in their sample, absolutely not. They found, in fact, some of the genes that this group found actually had the opposite reaction. So they became less common after the plague.
Huh.
Yeah, and
Did they do the same method? Was it just more?
It was just different samples. It seems like the method was more or less similar, because that was my first default. I'm like, these papers were published, a couple years apart. It doesn't seem like that's what it was. I mean, there are always like technique differences and stuff. I think part of it is the analysis. So I also found a bioRxiv paper where this group, I don't know that this paper is going to get published. The original study that we just watched a video on, there is a group that has written a paper teasing apart their data and explaining essentially why that other group, this is a brutal paper.
This one?
Yeah, they're pretty much calling that first group an idiot. This is the title of their paper. They didn't do anything other than look at these other people's data, and this is what they called it. insufficient evidence for natural selection associated with Black Death. The title of their paper is "You Guys Were Wrong." That's the title of their paper. And I don't know if this is going to get published. This is in bioarchives, by the way, so this has not been peer reviewed. The paper that refuted with the data, that has been peer reviewed and published. So we had a paper in 2022 being like, look, the Black Death changed our genome in this way. And then like 2 weeks ago, another paper came out and was like, we don't seem to see that in our data. And then because I was interested in that, I came across this. It is a brutal takedown. Insufficient evidence for natural selection associated with Black Death. You guys, this is academic speak for you guys are idiots. They're telling you all what they did. Here we show that these claims, so the claims of that last paper, are unsupported for 4 reasons. Okay, so pretty much they did their statistics wrong. Argument 1, p-value increases by 10 orders of magnitude and is no longer significant. They're saying group 1 did their math wrong. Oh, yeah. Second, technical error in how they filtered. Third, filtering thresholds do not adequately correct for multiple testing. Pretty much they don't like their math. And then let's see, finally, we find no evidence of significant frequency change in either of the data reported or in published data spanning the last 2000. Okay, so I did read all of the papers. I do think that these guys have a valid point. I still like the Nature paper because they did experimentation on top of their observations. But if it was just, if we put this paper aside where they're like coming at the math behind it all, I would say it doesn't really surprise me that a GWAS study doesn't replicate Balint, because I don't find GWAS studies that convincing. Like, if we're trying to look for these small changes in genetic variation, they only had a couple hundred people for each study. And I don't mean a couple hundred people in each group. I mean a couple hundred people after, like, of all of the time points. Like, I just don't...
Second paper that you were talking about, because you were saying that they found, like, different samples.
Yeah.
And so that could very well push on that front, too. Like, you just didn't sample enough.
It's just random. Yeah, I mean, your statistics are supposed to correct for that.
But it's not like they didn't. It's not like they did it wrong.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm real critical of GWAS studies. This kind of, like, we're gonna, like, do a genetic screening and go do some fancy mathing and see what we can find. I'm usually not convinced by them. I do remember when that paper came out, and I thought it was interesting that they did do experimentation. But it doesn't...
dish, right? You said, like, just this little one in the
and
dish.
it doesn't, I mean, it wasn't great, but... Okay, anyway, I liked this because, alright, these guys are coming hard. If they did their math wrong, then that was bad science. However, from what I can tell right now, it's mostly just scientific discourse doing what scientific discourse do. Like, one group had a finding. It was a good faith finding, but sometimes we're just wrong. Like, we do everything correctly, and sometimes it was just random chance. Like, I could make all sorts of claims about what happens if I flip a coin, you know? Every time you flip a coin, you expect it's like 50% chance, head or tails, right? But you'll randomly get strings of 10 heads in a row. Yeah. And that can lead you to incorrect conclusions. And the statistical tests and statistical modeling we do is supposed to account for that, but it's not perfect. And so sometimes it just happens. And then the question is, well, which study is right? Was it the first study or was it the second study? The first study is the one that said, yes, we found this gene that seems to have increased in survivors, and also it has this interesting autoimmune disorder. Or was it the newest group that was like, no, we looked in Cambridge and we don't see any of what you saw? It's interesting scientific discourse, and this is why we need multiple groups out there looking at these questions in multiple different ways, and hopefully the truth comes out of it. I mean, there's valuable data in there, but from what I can tell, this was not a case. There have been a few high profile cases of just out and out like fraud. That's not what this is. This is just how science works sometimes.
I thought it was cool. I'm disappointed.
You're disappointed?
Well, because, like, the first argument that you were making, like, with the first paper, it sounded, like, reasonable. And
it is reasonable. It is reasonable. It's also totally reasonable that maybe that event was not catastrophic enough to actually shape human evolution in a small time scale. That's also totally reasonable. Yeah. And we just don't know which one is true. Both are reasonable. There's evidence for both. We'll have to wait and see. Unless someone did their math wrong.
Alliterating says, wouldn't the majority of people who survived the Black Death have something that made them better suited to survive? That was the idea, Illuminati.
That was what they were thinking, and that's why
Yeah,
that's why they did the original study. But also maybe not. A lot of it can just be more circumstance, like what's your nutrition? What is your overall health like? What kind of access do you have? Like, it can be, there are so many other like random factors that are going to influence your survival or not, that maybe your genetics really doesn't have much to do with it. That was the theory, though. That was the hypothesis, is that, you know, this was a catastrophic event, that maybe it did change the human genome, sort of, like, of the people in that area. Maybe their DNA, the survivors, did have something different, and we can see traces of it. That's what they wanted to see. And it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. And the conclusions they came to seemed reasonable. But I will say it's also perfectly reasonable to say the opposite, that no, it's just there was too much other random stuff, and the Black Death was indiscriminate enough that, and it was on such a small time scale, that no, the human DNA is not going to have changed between one group and the other. Both are reasonable. But yeah, there's no question that, like, illness and disease has, over the entire time of our species, driven natural selection. The question was, could they see it on the small scale? And the answer is, we don't know. Maybe, maybe not.